All right. In terms of a quick devotional, real quick. Anybody ever heard the phrase? We use it a lot in church. The battle is not yours; it belongs to the Lord. You've heard that phrase? Anybody know where that comes from? And Jacqueline, don't look it up and cheat. She's on the computer. It's so quick, you know that you know. Okay, so you got Joshua, Judges. Anybody else want to take a stab? Because it's a pretty common quote. I mean, probably everybody in here has heard somebody say, "The battle is not yours; it belongs to the Lord." But I got to thinking about it because I happened to read it today in my personal reading, and I said, you know what? I bet most people don't know that that's the story that comes from, because it's kind of an obscure story. And so it's not Joshua and it's not Judges. It comes from a much later time, long after David and Solomon. There's a leader in Judah by the name of Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat is king. He was a good king. He was one of the better kings. He very well might have been. This is PH Fat, though. Just kidding. And so Jehoshaphat is king there in Judah. Now, they're not as strong at all as they were during the time of David and Solomon to overcome enemies, right? And so Ammon and Moab and the people of Mount Seir all formed this massive army to infiltrate Judah. And so when they got to the Negev, to En-Gedi, in that area of the wilderness, and Judah finds out about it, you know, they got close enough that they knew about it, then all of a sudden they start to get worried. And so Jehoshaphat, in front of everyone, has this big, long prayer where he says, you know, Lord, you're the one that brought us out, and we're not strong enough to defeat these people. You know, Israel was nice to them when we passed through the wilderness. We didn't attack them. And now look how they're repaying us, that whole thing. And so then there's a man, while Jehoshaphat is kind of getting everybody ready to trust the Lord, a man by the name of Jehaziel stands up, and the Bible says the Spirit of the Lord hit him, and he stood up in front of the congregation and said, everyone be at peace. The Lord told me to tell you the battle is not yours, it belongs to the Lord. And so what they decided to do was, when they went out to battle, he got everyone, instead of sending out his warriors, he sent out a worship team. And it says they sang praises to the Lord as they went out for battle. And the Bible says that as soon as they started singing praises, the Lord went to the battle himself and stirred them up so that when to fight against each other. And so when Israel showed up at the end of the march, the battle had been long over, and they were all laying dead on the ground, and they had killed each other. So the people of Mount Seir somehow had got upset with Ammon and Moab, and so they had this, you know, because of the Lord stirred them up. And so they had this fight between them during the camp, and they all killed each other, and it says not a single man escaped. And so this entire massive army was just dead when Israel got there for the fight. And so all they had to do was just pick up the loot, you know, all the stuff that they left behind. So that's where that comes from. The only other saying that's kind of like that is David when he fights Goliath. You know, he doesn't say that same thing, but he has that same kind of concept in there. He uses some of the same words. But that phrase itself, though, comes from Jehaziel. All right. So we're going to go into Deborah and Barak's story. And so I'm going to go ahead and hand out some pictures. And, you know, these pictures and stuff, I have gotten to where now a lot of times whenever I'm doing my own devotions. Did you get one? Okay. I was like, man, I thought for sure I gave you one. I said, did Mom keep 2 of them? Because I thought for sure I had handed out 2. All right. Oh, okay.
Exactly.
So this turn to the other side of the one that I showed you there. And I want you to see kind of the map there, and we'll kind of get our bearings from the map. Right? So this is the Galilee River up here, and then you've got the Jordan that comes down. And then in Israel, there are several kind of rivers, right? So there's two ways that the rivers that cross through, because all this stuff on the west side of the Jordan is a lot of fertile valleys, a lot of good farmland. It's a very good land through here, right? And the rivers tend to come from either one of two things. Either a tributary from the Mediterranean Sea will cut across the land, or an offshoot from the Jordan will cut across, right? And so they're kind of these crossing rivers that kind of cut through from these two bodies of water. So the river that cuts through right here off of the Jordan is called the Kishon River. Okay. And that's where a lot of this battle takes place. And the Kishon kind of goes pretty far all the way across. So this is Mount Carmel, where Elijah called down the fire. And the Kishon kind of goes right into that area. And so, and then there's a few mountains over here. There's Mount Tabor, and then Mount Gilboa, and then this valley that's here is the Jezreel Valley. Okay. And so that's where this battle takes place, is in the Jezreel Valley. This is where Megiddo is, right? So when you hear people talking about Armageddon, that's this valley where this battle with Deborah takes place, right? And so the way that the battle starts is Deborah is a judge in Ephraim. So Deborah does not become a judge when she wins the battle. She is already judging Ephraim before the battle. Because sometimes we think, oh, this giant battle, that was her claim to fame. It really wasn't. She was judging Israel when God started to speak to her about how to handle this battle, right? So she was already the judge. So how that comes about, the Bible doesn't really say, but she was judging from the hills there in Ephraim already. So we'll look at number 1 there on the map. It says, the Lord sold the Israelites into the power of the Canaanite king Jabin. So remember we touched on that last week a little bit, like how is there a Jabin, king of the Canaanites in Hazor, when in Joshua it says that he defeated Jabin, king of the Canaanites in Hazor. And so we talked about Jabin must be then just the name of their king, right? Like Pharaoh or Abimelech for the Philistines. And so he gets there, he says he reigned in Hazor, and the general of his army was Sisera, who lived in Heshreth Goim. Goim there is an interesting phrase. It gets translated a lot as Gentile. Have you ever heard that phrase in the Bible where it says Galilee of the Gentiles? That's in there in the New Testament. It's about Galilee of the Gentiles. Really what that is Galilee of the Goyim. And so there's a little wondering of were the Goyim actually a people at some point where they get this name Gentile from down the road. So that word there where they're having this battle, Heshreth Hogoim, where Sisera is coming from, is that Galilee region. That's the Galilee of the Gentiles. And so Sisera is the commander. Hazor is up here, right? Remember, this is the very northern battle that Joshua fought. So most of Joshua's battles were down south. He had the one campaign north where he wiped out Hazor, and then that opened up the door for all the northern tribes to enter into their inheritance. And so now, apparently these tribes have not asserted themselves very dominantly because you get the Canaanites have emerged again. And so, number 2, it says, Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men followed him. Deborah also went up with him. So you see Kadesh there at the very northern point, which I think is interesting because this is Hazor, where the enemy is. Deborah is way down here in Ephraim, but she gets a word from the Lord while she's down here that says, summon the people way up here in Kadesh. And that's what she tells Barak. And Barak says, well, I'll do it if you go with me. And so she goes with him. Now, one reason why that's a little intimidating is because that's on the other side of the enemy camp, way away from any help from the majority of the Israelite clans, right? So they're going past the enemy up into a place that is the most, like where the enemy kind of has them cut in half to the weaker side. And they go up there, and because I believe the reason that the Lord had them do that is because these are the tribes that are in the most danger, is the people up here, right? And so that's where he wants to amass the army from to fight this battle. And so Deborah and Barak make this long journey all the way up here to Kadesh, where they sound the trumpet for the battle, right? And they get their 10,000 men. Okay.
So was Barak down there and with Deborah? I was under the impression he was already up there.
Yeah, so Barak was, so Deborah's down here. Barak is from this area. Okay. Yeah, so Barak was not an Ephraimite. Barak was from this area up here as well. And so Deborah was the one that was down here in Ephraim. And so then they travel up here, and so Barak has this, sounding of the trumpet, if you will, is what kind of how they refer to it. And then they all kind of come together, they get their 10,000, and then go to number 3 there in the middle. It says, now Heber the Canaanite, right? So this was, the Canaanites were Moses' in-laws, right? So remember Jethro and all of them. This is their descendants. And they broke off from the camp and went way up north up here. And so they're up in this region as well. And so that becomes important later in the story because the wife there is the one that kills the general, right? So that's why that's kind of important. So the reason it kind of foreshadows that part and tells why they're up there is because later she's the one that kills the general, right? So they don't really have anything to do with the amassing of the battle or any of this preliminary stuff, but it does throw them in at the beginning so that you understand, who she was. For at the end of the battle, she becomes kind of the star of the show. All right, and then number 4, Sisera, after receiving reports that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, called out all 900 of his iron chariots and forces from Hashereth Hagoim to the Wadi Kishon, right? And so we talked about this is Mount Tabor right here. Okay, so if you go to the other side, that picture there is Mount Tabor, right? And so this is where Deborah and Barak bring the army to, right? Is in this area here, okay? And so it kind of draws them out. So after they have this kind of sounding of the trumpets thing, Barak comes down here to this area, and when the people in Hazor find out that Barak has amassed the army just south of them on Mount Tabor, then he says, okay, I guess that means it's time to come out and fight them. And so he then proceeds down here to engage them in battle. So basically what the Lord is giving them these commands almost to draw them out, because he's saying, all right, just sit there and wait on the mountain for a little bit. They'll come to you, right? And so Hazor then begins to come down. And then, I'll just read here. I'm just reading from this map. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots into panic before Barak, and Sisera himself dismounted from his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Hashereth Hagoim. The entire army of Sisera fell beneath the sword, with not even one surviving. So they fled back up here. Now, interestingly enough, that Hashereth Hagoim is past Hazor. And it says Sisera was from there. So when they flee, a lot of the army probably just went back to Hazor. But Sisera himself keeps right on going. And he's heading back to his hometown. And on his way to his hometown, he becomes tired and stops in at the Canaanites' camp. And that's where he's killed. Right? And so the reason I want to put this river stuff up there is because in the Song of Deborah, it talks about how the Lord caused the Kishon to be at kind of flooding. So whether it was raining or whether it was flooding, it's a little unclear, but the Lord used the water coming off of this Kishon to make everything muddy in the valley, right? And so that's why their army got shut down, because they're relying on chariots. And so they're thinking, okay, here it is, it's the valley. That's where chariots become dominant, is in the valley. They can't fight in the hills. And so they come down here to this valley. That's why this valley is so important of Armageddon, because once they started getting chariots, you can't fight in the hills anymore. They have to find a big wide open valley where they can fight, and that was Armageddon. And so that's where all of these battles were taking place, was in this Jezreel Valley. Jezreel Valley is the name of the valley. Megiddo was a city in the Jezreel. And so that's where they get Armageddon from. And then it becomes popular in Revelation, right? They talk about this final battle at the Jezreel Valley in Armageddon. So what we'll see later, we'll talk about some other battles that took place here. But I guess what I want you to see is that it's possible that there could be another final battle there. But if you're thinking from John's perspective that the historical battlefield of all these major battles has been the Jezreel, that's where you go to fight your enemies. That's where the enemies would always flock to if they wanted to fight Israel out in the open fields. And so it's possible that he's using imagery in Revelation, and not so much that there's actually going to be another world battle. I mean, there could be. I don't know, but I'm just saying that the two things to consider is either that is a literal prophecy, that it is going to be an actual battle there again, or he is, from an Israelite perspective, drawing this imagery. And if you want to talk about a giant battle, because all of these were massive, where there'd be like the hordes of some country would come in and they'd camp out in the Jezreel. And so if you wanted to describe some big, massive battle that goes on, that would be the way to do it from Israelite history. That was where all the battles took place. So it's possible that when he's talking about in Armageddon, in this big final battle, that it is he's using that imagery and those wordings because that's where all their battles were. So whether it's going to be a literal one there, or if that's just symbolic of some great battle, it's hard to know. But so anyways, that's just kind of...
You wouldn't think in today's time and technology that there would be a big battle
like that. Yeah.
Between two armies.
Yeah. Especially world armies. Yeah. When you're talking about the world battles, that it would seem strange for the U.S. to send all of their troops lined up in battle to the Jezreel Valley, to fight China or Russia's troops, But I mean, it's possible that there could be some decisive battle there, just like D-Day was not the totality of the war, but that was the battlefield that turned the tide, right? And so, just thought that was interesting that this Kishon then becomes really the tool of the Lord, right? So we talked about the battle is not yours, it belongs to the Lord, and that all throughout this period of Joshua and Judges, we see the Lord winning the battle, but it's in different ways in various, battles. And so sometimes the Lord stirs them into confusion, like he did with Jehoshaphat and Gideon. And sometimes the Lord, we talked about Ezekiel, throws down stones from heaven. Sometimes here in this valley, he just causes it to overflow. And then all of a sudden their chariots are stuck and their advantage is gone. And so it throws them into fear because they have no advantage. And that's why, if you remember, Sisera, the Bible says Sisera jumped out of his chariot and ran. And that's why. Because if he's really trying to get out of there, a horse-drawn chariot, it would be the preferred way to get out of the valley if it wasn't, if it wasn't flooded, right? And so that's why he jumped out. And in Deborah's song, there's a really big, long song of Deborah's in there. It takes the entire chapter. And that's where she talks about it. And in there she also talks about how several of the other tribes did not come out to help, right? I think Ephraim has kind of I wouldn't say the majority of the judges, but I think Ephraim has quite a few, considering there were 12 tribes, that 4 of these judges ended up coming out of Ephraim, right? And that's... I'm including Joshua in that, so he wasn't really a judge, but he's kind of like one. that he fulfilled that role of leader. So in this time period, right in the beginning, they have 4. There's Joshua, Tola, Deborah, and Pirathim, I think is his name, Pirathon. And so they had quite a few coming out of Ephraim. All right.
Do you think that could have anything to do with Ephraim not really helping out in any of the battles, with them kind of sitting on the sidelines?
You're saying why they had more judges? It could be, but I think what it is when you look through some of this, Ephraim actually gets upset several times because no one let them know the battle was going on. So whatever that means, I don't know. I think part of what's going on, just my own personal opinion, is that when they divided up the tribes, Joshua was the head, right? And so the tribe of Ephraim, when they move into the land, is used to being the premier tribe because Joshua was their leader, right? And so they got, for all intents and purposes, of the land they saw in the southern part, because they hadn't gone up into a lot of this area to even see this much. They just sent some spies up there to divide that. They had gone up into Hazor. But of the area that they saw, Ephraim got some pretty good land there, right? Bethel, Shechem, Shiloh, Gilgal, Jericho, all these like major cities that we read about in Joshua, all that ended up going to Ephraim. And so they have these major region there, and it almost makes you wonder if once Joshua passed, if they weren't wanting to promote themselves back into leadership consistently. Every time somebody would go and fight, here shows up Ephraim with their warriors saying, "Hey, you didn't let us know. We wanted to head up this battle." And so it makes you wonder, were they trying to continue to be the lead tribe all the way through some of this stuff? Because about 3 times there were battles, and for whatever reason, Ephraim seems like they didn't even know about it. And so then they show up once the battle is over, and they're ready to fight their other Israelites because they split up the loot, and Ephraim was left out of it. Or it could be that maybe they didn't tell Ephraim because Ephraim had been the dominant tribe, and so you're kind of thinking, "Hey, I'd like to somebody else," because between the time of Deborah and Joshua up to this point, quite a few of the judges had been coming from this general region. And then I would think the other reason that you had so many come from Ephraim is because that was the first place that they settled. All the settled camps would have been primarily in Ephraim because that was the first part of the land that Israel really controlled well. They controlled a lot of the land in Judah, but that's where the Philistines were. The border between Dan and Judah was Philistine area, and so they didn't fully control that. And then these northern areas, they had wiped out the major city, but there were tons of smaller camps all through this that they hadn't done anything with. And so all those northern areas were still saturated with Canaanites. And they never did really get a lot of them out. So that's the Battle of Deborah. There's not a whole lot of intrigue to it, although several of the tribes didn't come out. And so she talks about that in her song, how she's upset that several of them didn't come out, but some of them did. And so particularly some of these northern tribes ended up coming out. And in her song, she talks about the ones that didn't come out.
I always think that. How did the unity with, Israel's not that big.
Right.
I mean, some places God is apart.
Right.
And you say that this particular judge ruled for 40 years from one place.
Yeah. And so while they're ruling, does everybody else, consent to that? Or is this that was, from their point of view, that was the only one that could have been considered, the leader. I don't know. It goes back to that thing we were talking about, how when Saul was running around, he didn't even know who Samuel was, and he didn't even know his name. And so, and that was at the end of Samuel's life when he had been judged for like 80 years. So, So he didn't know any of that stuff, and so I think that's just kind of interesting. You know.
Characteristic, because after David killed Goliath, Saul said, "Who is that boy?"
Yeah, and
He started playing his instrument for him, singing to him.
That's bad memory.
He just had that.
yeah, and it makes you wonder, that thing with David, you know, how that happened. Either that was a snippet from somewhere else, like the Bible does that. Particularly Samuel does that 3 other times that I know of, where it will tell something that happened and then tell something that happened before it, you know, like kind of to set, you know. So when Saul is looking for the donkeys, it tells you all of that, and then it goes back in and says, but several days before that, God had already told Samuel that he would cause Saul to show up at that day, and when he showed up, that's who you were going to anoint as the first king. And so whoever the author was, the human author of Samuel, uses that style where he will cut back in a chapter to show something that happened earlier for effect. So it's possible that is what's going on, and why it would seem that, okay, he's already been in Saul's house, and so what it could be is when he says he wouldn't let David go back to Jesse, that is a reference to the fact that he was playing the music. Because as soon as he kills Goliath, he says he doesn't let him go back to Jesse after that. So it could be that when he's saying that, like when you read it in the story, it makes it seem like because he was such a battle commander, he didn't let him go back. But it really doesn't say why he didn't let him go back. So it could be that is the explanation of the singing, you know. But he still should have known who it was, because otherwise, then you would think,
Well, the other
you know.
thing, the disciples in the boat, after Jesus stopped the storm, they said, "Who is this man that he even controls the weather?" So it could have been Saul, like, "Who is this guy?"
Right? Yeah.
You know, no,
Yeah.
he just played his guitar and sang to me.
Right.
He's going out killing time. Who is this?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it could be because they mentioned then that he's the son of Jesse, and it could be hey, is this the son of someone famous? You know, who is this? And they say, well, this is Jesse's son. You know, so it's almost a saying of, okay, I know the guy's name, but where is this guy from? What is his story? Who is this? You know. Yeah. All right, so I want to go into Gideon while we still have some time. I have a few more pictures from the Gideon one than I do from Deborah's. And then next week we're going to do Samson. It's 2 each, yeah. And as I normally do, I've got the color photos of these online if you want to see them online. I search. Yeah, so if I know the name of a place, and I do this now, so this is something that you can steal if you want. It's kind of nice. Whenever I'm reading a chapter now from the Bible, what I will do is, so these are all from different places. So each of these things that I give you, the way I do it is I'll go through the Bible, and if I recognize a particular region, I will type that in the search bar, and then it brings you up all these web pages. But what I do is at the top it says web or images, and so you can go just to images. And when you click on images, instead of having a list of web pages, it has a list of pictures that it relates to whatever city that you did. And so I will scroll through those until I find a few good ones, and I'll pull it up a lot of times, and I will have it on my screen while I'm reading, which is kind of nice. So that while I'm reading about this battle that's taking place here, I'll have the full color thing up on the computer. Kind of helps you be more in the moment, So that may be something you may want to do in your morning devotions, and it helps you then to put a picture to the place a little better. Helps you.
Geography class that you offer?
I seen another Bible school, and they had a geography class that comes with the first video.
Right.
So kind of to get the student familiar with.
Yeah, well, sometimes like in my Old Testament class, I did do a lot with the maps. I don't know if you remember that, but Old Testament survey. each class I brought you in a map. And then, so instead of having a geography class, kind of what I try and do, because I really, as you can tell, I'm all about the maps. And so, but I guess for me, the way that I do is I try and integrate it into each class, the geography for that particular subject matter. And I think what it is by now, I feel like I've integrated it so much that when we start talking about regions, you have a pretty good idea, where we're talking about now, which is really what you want. And then you can add to that now actual snapshots of certain hills and valleys and things like that. And that really, it's just kind of fun. You're all by yourself. You're at the house. You've got a big picture of the valley where David fought. And, you can kind of get into it a little more that way. It's kind of like playing, I don't have David action figures, so,